Picture this. You are a woman in medieval Europe. You are educated. You read Latin. You write poetry. You manage property, run institutions, correspond with popes and kings, and exercise a form of authority that virtually no other woman in your society can access. You also love another woman, deeply, documentably, in writing that has survived 800 years. And the institution that gave you all of that education, that authority, that access, that same institution is going to spend the next several centuries deciding whether what you felt was friendship, spiritual devotion, or something they need to condemn. Spoiler, they never quite made up their minds, which is why the documents survived. Welcome to the medieval convent. One of the most misunderstood institutions in the history of Western civilization, and one of the most important spaces for understanding what women's lives actually look like before the modern era. Let's start with what the convent actually was. Because the popular image, cloistered women in gray habits, silent corridors, austere piety, is not wrong exactly, but it is catastrophically incomplete. The medieval convent was a place of significant intellectual and economic power. The great convents of medieval Europe, Fontevraud in France, Gondersheim in Germany, Whitby in England, Las Huelgas in Spain, were not retreats from the world, they were institutions within it. They owned land, they collected rents, they ran schools, they produced manuscripts, they trained artists, musicians, and scholars. The abbess of a major convent held a rank equivalent to a bishop in practical terms. She governed a community, managed finances, corresponded with secular and religious authorities, and exercised jurisdiction over the people and property under her care. For a woman of the medieval period, the convent was one of the only available paths to something resembling an independent intellectual life. Marriage meant subordination to a husband's authority. The convent meant subordination to a rule, but a rule that also provided education, community, and a form of identity that was not defined entirely by relation to a man. This is the context in which the documented relationships between women in medieval convents need to be understood. These were not naive women who didn't know what they were feeling. They were educated, literate women who had read the classical literature on love and desire, who had access to a tradition of writing about intense emotional bonds, and who chose, deliberately, to write about their relationships with other women in terms that their contemporaries would have recognized as romantic. Let's talk about specific cases. Hildegard of Bingen, born 1098, died 1179, composer, theologian, naturalist, mystic, and one of the most documented figures of the 12th century. She entered religious life as a child and spent her entire life in female religious communities. She eventually founded her own convent at Rupertsberg, near Bingen on the Rhine. Hildegard had a relationship with a young nun named Richardis von Stade that her own letters describe in terms that generations of scholars have struggled to categorize. When Richardis was appointed abbess of another convent, a significant promotion, Hildegard's response was not congratulation, it was devastation. She wrote letters to Richardis's mother, to the Archbishop of Mainz, and eventually to Pope Eugenius III, trying to prevent the transfer. Her letters describe her love for Richardis with an intensity that the vocabulary of spiritual friendship barely contains. When Richardis died shortly after her appointment, Hildegard wrote that she had loved the nobility of Richardis's conduct, her virtue, and all her life. The language she uses, the Latin terms for love, longing, and loss, are the same terms used in secular love poetry of the period. Hildegard herself was aware of the potential interpretation. Her writing on the subject is careful, theologically framed, constantly redirecting the emotional intensity toward God. But the emotion is visible through the framing. You do not write to the Pope about a colleague's transfer if what you feel is merely professional regard. Now let's talk about Heloise and the convent she didn't choose. Heloise d'Argenteuil is most famous for her relationship with the philosopher Peter Abelard, a relationship that ended when Abelard was castrated by her uncle's hired men, after which Heloise took religious vows at Abelard's insistence. She eventually became abbess of the Paraclete, the community Abelard had founded. Her letters to Abelard are among the most extraordinary documents of the medieval period, frank about desire, grief, and the gap between what she felt and what she was supposed to feel. But less discussed are the relationships within her community at the Paraclete. The letters between Heloise and the women she led describe bonds of the kind that the medieval church had a specific term for: amicitia spiritualis, spiritual friendship, but that the actual language of the letters often exceeds. Heloise was aware of the tension. Her theological writing directly addresses the question of how to understand intense, emotional bonds between women in religious communities. She frames the question carefully, but she does not resolve it, and her refusal to resolve it is itself significant. Let's move to the most explicitly documented case, the nun of Admont. In the 12th century, in the Benedictine monastery of Admont, in what is now Austria, a nun wrote a letter to another nun that has survived in a manuscript collection. The letter is a love letter, not metaphorically, not interpretively, a love letter, in Latin, from one woman to another, using the standard vocabulary of medieval romantic correspondence. The letter describes physical longing, emotional dependence, the specific quality of the beloved's presence, and the pain of separation. It uses the same formal conventions as secular love letters of the period, the same opening formulas, the same rhetorical structures, the same emotional vocabulary. Whoever wrote it had been educated in the tradition of medieval letter writing and chose to apply that tradition to her feelings for another woman. This letter is not unique. Scholars working on medieval manuscript collections have identified multiple letters between women in religious communities that use romantic or explicitly erotic language. The collection known as the Tegernsee letters from a Bavarian monastery includes several such documents. They were preserved. Someone, many someones, over many centuries considered them worth keeping. Why were they kept? This is a question worth asking. The obvious answer, that the people who preserved them didn't recognize what they were reading, is probably too simple. Medieval readers were not naive about desire. They had read Ovid, they had read Sappho, they understood what love letters looked like. The more likely answer is that the people who preserved these documents made a decision, conscious or unconscious, that the relationships they documented were within the range of what a religious community could contain. Medieval Christianity had a complex and not entirely consistent relationship with intense emotional bonds between members of the same sex. The tradition of spiritual friendship, rooted in the writings of figures like Aelred of Rievaulx, who wrote extensively about love between men in monastic contexts, provided a framework that could accommodate intense same-sex bonds by framing them as a path toward divine love rather than away from it. This framework was genuinely available. It was not simply a cover for something else, but it was also capacious enough to contain things that modern readers would identify as romantic love. The Church's formal position that same-sex sexual acts were sinful coexisted with a lived reality in which intense same-sex emotional bonds were documented, preserved, and in some cases celebrated within the very institutions that formally condemned what those bonds might involve. This is not hypocrisy in the simple sense. It is the complexity of a large institution containing human beings whose experience does not fit neatly into its formal categories, and sometimes choosing, quietly, to preserve the evidence of that experience rather than destroy it. Now let's talk about what happened to this record. The dissolution of the monasteries in England under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541 destroyed hundreds of religious communities and their archives. The specific targeting of female religious communities during the Reformation, in England, Germany, Scandinavia, and elsewhere, eliminated not just the institutions, but the communities of practice and the documentary records they had accumulated. What survived did so largely by accident. Manuscripts that ended up in secular libraries, letters that were copied into collections before the originals were lost, documents that were considered theologically useful regardless of their other content. The 19th century brought a different kind of erasure. When scholars began systematically studying medieval manuscripts, they encountered these documents with a set of assumptions about medieval religious life that did not include same-sex desire as a possibility. Letters between women that used romantic language were classified as examples of spiritual friendship and set aside. The category of romantic friendship, a 19th century concept, was applied retrospectively to medieval relationships in ways that systematically removed the sexual and romantic dimension from the documentary record. The 20th century brought re-examination. Scholars like Judith Bennett, Karma Lockery, and E. Ann Matter began reading these documents with different questions and found different answers. The documents had not changed, the questions had. The letters are still in the archives. The manuscripts are in the libraries. Hildegard's correspondence is edited and translated. The Tegernsee letters have been published. The Nun of Admont's love letter has been analyzed in peer-reviewed journals. The relationships they document were real. The women who had them were real. They lived in institutions that simultaneously gave them more intellectual freedom than almost any other available option and required them to frame their deepest feelings in language that could survive the scrutiny of celibacy. They found the language. They used it. The documents survived. Someone just had to decide to read them as what they are.